All right, well, let's get started. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are super excited. We had so much fun on Tuesday. I personally have been excited about this event and this session for several months now. I think that when we're on the back end of this event today, you will see why and why I enjoy the conversations with this panel. I would meet with them weekly if they'd let me. I always learn so much from them. So I'll start today's session with sharing some thoughts and some data. And I want to start with the disclaimer first that some of the conversation today may be activating. So please make sure that you're exercising self-care and taking care of yourself during this session. So I'll start by sharing that trauma has no boundaries. You can't hide away from it by age, by gender, by socioeconomic situation, race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. Trauma is impacting us all. It is an equal opportunity presenter. And the effects of trauma place incredible burdens on the individual, on the family, on their families, and the community, our society on a whole. We know that some humans are able to move on and live processing and dealing with their trauma, but at what cost? And what potential is lost? That's the question I want us to think about today. And what are we being robbed of as a society because of people having to deal with that trauma? So I've heard from many of my peers the kind of tilt in the neck we want to have when we hear that October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. It's crazy that it has to be acknowledged one month. It should be something that we are creating awareness about every day. So I know that there is some irony in that statement, but it is October, and we're acknowledging that, as well as the 29th anniversary of the Violence Against Women's Act, as we enter into this segment today. So there's a lot for us to think about. And before we get started, I want you guys to look at this segment today through a couple different lenses. And I want that to be, how is this impacting the workplace? So it's robbing us. It's bringing violence into the workplace. It's impacting potential in the workplace. And you'll hear from our speakers who are much more eloquent than I am about how trauma and how we process trauma and how we process traumatic brain injury and acknowledge it and how we heal from trauma really has impact on the workplace and our day-to-day life. You've heard me say before, if you've heard me speak, that we do most of our adult learning at work. So these are where these two things intersect. So enough from me. Let's hear from our awesome panel. And we have placed in the chat their bios. Please take a minute to read through that. We want every minute with them, so we are not going to use our time hearing about the incredible things that they've already achieved. We want to have meaningful conversation with them. So our panel today, Dr. Mary Clyde Pierce, Dr. Edie Sussman, and Dr. Christine de Blasio. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And let's get started. Okay, so if I could have just take a few minutes and share with us what's going on and how do you see yourself in the violence prevention conversation, or do you even see yourself in the violence prevention conversation? So, Dr. Mary Clyde Pierce, could you share your thoughts on that? A little bit about what you're doing now, and do you see yourself in this violence prevention conversation?
Yes. I'm sorry, I've got background noise. Can you hear me okay?
Great, we can hear you great.
Super, super. Yeah, I'm Mary Clyde Pierce. I'm a pediatric emergency medicine physician, but I'm also a child abuse injury researcher. And I got into that because I kept seeing these children that had very specific injuries that were so different than children that had accidental injury versus children that were exposed to violence or had violent acts against them. And I really became obsessed with trying to figure out how to identify those children early on. And then I became obsessed with trying to figure out why they ended up having worse outcomes later in life. And so I really am passionate that violent acts against children are getting embedded into their gene expression and causing them to not fulfill the real lives, what they were born to, how they were born to be, or how their life's potential was, how they were set to go. And so I'm really excited about this conference and being able to not only figure out why it's happening, but how it's happening, so we can figure out how to reverse it and restore these children back to a much healthier space. Even when the violence against them is only skin deep, it seems to be getting into their gene expression, which is just huge for us to think differently about this.
Thank you, Dr. Pierce. And I'll share with you, Dr. Pierce joined us at our first summit, which was in person here in Chicago last year. And then we have been fast and furious friends ever since, and can't go through a lunch or an interaction without talking about these issues. So thank you, Dr. Pierce, for being here. So, Dr. Sussman, how do you see this? Are you in violence prevention? And if so, tell us, share with us.
This is such important work, and I am incredibly grateful to be here with Dr. Pierce and Dr. de Blasio. I feel like the issue of unrecognized brain injury in the workplace is a biopsychosocial issue with so many different elements that add up. I am a trauma-trained neurosurgeon. So in the old days, the only time that I'd see people with brain injuries is if they were unconscious and came through my emergency room, and I bring them to the operating room. During COVID, I had started a traumatic brain injury and concussion clinic and really began to recognize the mental health presentation of a lot of folks who maybe don't recognize that mental health presentation can really be part of an underlying brain injury. So that's some of the expertise that I bring.
Thank you, Dr. Sussman. Dr. de Blasio, I'm going to give a shout out real quick. USA Today Woman of the Year for the state of Vermont. So join us, Dr. Blasio. Please share with us how you fit into this violence prevention puzzle.
Well, like many things, I didn't start out in violence prevention. I'm a psychologist, and I've worked with trauma survivors, surviving all sorts of violence for over 30 years. So I was on the tail end, helping people heal. And then along the way, I started training in the martial arts. Just trained along with my daughters. I was the last to join and the only one still continuing to train. So I have a 5th degree black belt in Kempo Jitsu, karate. And it was through that work that I started doing some prevention work, merging those two fields, both the empowerment, self-defense, the martial arts, with my work as a psychologist to develop a really, I think, state-of-the-art trauma-informed empowerment, self-defense, violence prevention program. Through that, we realized that not all survivors would feel comfortable attending a group class. So we developed a slightly different program called Therapeutic Empowerment Self-Defense, which is on the treatment end and is formulated in a different, we offer it in a different format. The curriculum's a little bit different. And the way that I like to describe them is our empowerment self-defense, our violence prevention program, is prevention with a side of healing. And our trauma treatment program, our therapeutic program, is healing with a side of prevention. And so that's how I've ended up in the violence prevention world, although I started in the treatment world.
Thank you, Dr. de Blasio. And we're going to hear more about that great work that you're doing. I have a couple of questions for you so that you could share with everybody that's joined us today. So I'm going to come back to Dr. Pierce. So Dr. Pierce, we have had some incredible conversations. And if you could share with our attendees today, what happens to our body when we're processing trauma, and what happens to that cellular makeup? I know I would have never thought I would ever be using the word epigenetics as often as I do now, and I do that because of you. So please share with us, Dr. Pierce.
Well, it's epigenetics obviously is a kind of a new field. It's been around for a long time, but it's becoming more and more common for people to think about it and know about it. And so epigenetics, unlike genetics, we're born with the genes. You have the same genes but they have to get turned on or off in order to have you operate in your normal life or build cells or build bone or whatever, or have osteoporosis or whatever. Also, your stress response, though, much of your stress response is regulated through an epigenetic process as well. And to make it wildly simple, more simple than it really is, but just to help kind of with communication, if you think about it as you having all these genes that help build who you are and help you emotionally respond to what you need to respond to, but those genes have to be turned on or off. And so they get turned on or off by what's happening in our environment. So your stress response system, for example, how you make cortisol or other things, that gets turned on or off, or how your brain is when your brain is injured, how it gets turned on or off, how to heal it or how to respond to that trauma. It's all through an epigenetic process. And so I really became obsessed, there's no other way to put it, obsessed with why abused children that are exposed to violence, specifically that are exposed to violence, especially domestic violence, but children that are exposed to violence, why is it that even as a baby, that they are far more likely to have developmental delay, even if they don't have any external signs of injury, or obvious signs of brain injury? Why do they have developmental delay at like wildly higher rates than do their counterparts that are not abused? Why do they have more likely to have immune problems? Why are they more likely to have cancers or diabetes? Why is that? And understanding that why could potentially help us reverse that or do personalized medicine for these children that are exposed to violence. And so that's when I started like really delving into the epigenetic process of how your genes get turned on or how they get turned off or how they don't respond properly to trauma, to toxins, and to stress. So I think of violence as actually being an environmental toxin. I literally think of it as being an environmental toxin, just like lead is an environmental toxin. Violence is actually more dangerous than lead even. And it can actually cause our genes to turn on or off through an epigenetic response, and it can cause your brain to build or not repair properly when you're under too much cortisol or too much stress. So your brain may not repair itself properly, even with what seemingly minor traumas. And so I don't even remember what the question was now, but I'm excited about this.
No, I mean, thank you. I mean, you are sharing, you put it very simple for me in simple terms. And you said, I think what you're doing, I think the type of training that empowerment self-defense, which is the training that PAVE is based in, music, sports, other activities, can flip those epigenetic switches once they've been damaged. And
Right.
That's what was incredible for me to hear from you, and your explanation on how they get switched in the wrong direction and how we need to find the right combinations to switch them back.
Right, right. And I wouldn't even consider it damage. This is the way I kind of think of it. I think of it like this, like I love car engines. I think engines are fascinating. And so think of it as having this amazing car engine, and yet you have it pedal to the metal, you have it floored, completely floored. And that engine may be okay for a little while, but that engine's going to start getting damaged from that being just like 100% pedal to the metal acceleration. So that damage starts occurring and accumulating over time. So what we need to do is figure out, and we are figuring out, how do we actually take the foot off the throttle? How do we actually get those epigenetic switches to go back to having a governor on them, so to speak, so that they can actually be at a healthy state? So, we need to be able to respond like crazy sometimes, but we don't want to stay in that state. And so being able to understand what stress is actually really good for us, when stress is really actually critical for our survival, and yet how do we actually help regulate it or learn to, regulate that, like Dr. de Blasio was talking about. So I just love that we can figure out how we can interact with children and how our interactions with those children can make a difference. We know for a fact that like some types of really amazing parental parent-child therapies that are going on, or different kinds of physical things that we're having children do, can actually put those switches back into a healthier state. Some really cool researchers across the country are looking at that. We're starting to look at that. And so there is all the reason in the world to not turn away from this, to turn to it with all of our energy and all of our optimism, but to come up with solutions that are reality-based and not just these huge assumptions where we're just throwing money and, like literally throwing it at the wind. I almost said a cuss word, but I'm trying not to cuss. So where we're just throwing the money at the wind. Let's do this methodically and with great thought and with information back from the patients and our families that we're taking care of, rather than just making these huge assumptions that have really taken us off base, I think, sometimes.
So, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Pierce. You and I, like I said, we have shared, we hear these stories all the time. Well, sports saved my life. Well,
Yes.
music saved my life. Where, we hear it in our community, that 16-hour session at, Impact saved my life, or,
Yeah.
empowerment self-defense training saved my life. So we hear that, and we know that it's one of those things that flip those switches. So let me move to Dr. Edie. Dr. Edie. So I'm going to share some statistics with our participants today, because I'm not quite sure. It was quite shocking to me during our conversations, that 75% of domestic violence survivors suffer single or repeated traumatic brain injury, most going unreported. Wow. Wow. So please talk to us about this silent epidemic that is occurring, and how it influences really everything. It influences how they're perceived on the witness stand. It influences how they reported. Please share with us.
Yeah, super important. Thank you for calling that out. Sometimes, think about how much attention's been paid to the 2000 NFL players, and we've got 2 million women, LGBTQ plus children, men, persons of color, immigrants who are sustaining brain injuries at a rate that is far more prevalent and more common than any of our sports-induced injuries. It looks like at each individual violent event, if we include both strangulation-induced brain injuries and traumatic-induced brain injuries, we're looking at 80 to 90% injuries to the head and neck. And when we did our research at the Mayo Clinic Network affiliate in Northern California, what we found that was different between people who came in from domestic violence and people who came in from brain injuries, from car accidents and falls and surfing and sporting events, the biggest difference was the number of lifetime traumatic brain injuries. In sports, it might have been around 2 to 3. In domestic violence, it was 6, sometimes 10. And there were a few people who actually shared that they felt like they had too many to remember. And so I want to say that when we think about violence in the workplace, I think we're really looking at both sides of this equation and bringing in this new lens, just as Dr. Pierce said, doing the same thing we've been doing for 20 years and expecting a different result isn't going to get us there, no matter how much money we put toward it. I think we've really got to start looking at these new directions like epigenetics and what's the role of traumatic brain injury. And I think what I want to say is we may actually have a window to both the victim side in the workplace and the perpetrator or aggressor side in the workplace, because some of the research that we're now moving into really links brain injury as one of the underlying factors for some of the emotional lability we've seen. Have you ever heard somebody say, well, he just has a short fuse? Or some of our car accident patients, they'll say things like, boy, I go from 0 to 100 now in a split second. I might be calm and then somebody will bump me and I'll just feel like I want to hit them. And so if we put that into the context that Dr. Pierce gave us about the lifetime occurrence of brain injury and exposure to violence and being adrenalized and being under stress, I feel like this is the perfect venue for thinking about the brain injury in this context.
Yeah, I mean, we hear people say things like hurt people, but this is literally now like brain injury to the brain may cause or could cause or is causing them to hurt people because it's going undetected, right? And what happens because of TBI?
Yeah, I think we've got issues with people who have emotional dysregulation and other types of mental health presentations, irritability, anger management, PTSD. A lot of those now that we're really getting granular, that we're looking at root cause, we're seeing a very surprising and high association between the incidence of multiple traumatic brain injuries over a lifetime. And let's just bring in that this is an and conversation. That it's brain injuries plus the dreadful lived experiences that can also change who a person is and how they engage with those around them.
I love that.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for bringing those two together, right? Because I don't want to speak about them separate. They need to be put together. So thank you, Dr. Sussman. The last thing I'm going to ask you to touch upon, Dr. Sussman, is when we're dealing with traumatic brain injury, could you just give us a little bit of information about what happens to our memory?
Sure. So in the domestic violence world, we have really a very mixed picture. It's much more like mixed martial arts. And we actually went to, for example, MMA to get our guidelines for what we should do to evaluate domestic violence victims, as opposed to folks who've had, a baseball accident where they were hit in the head with a baseball. In the domestic violence world, we're seeing multimodality, hitting, kicking, slapping. In that environment, they're being struck with something. And there's also the change in blood flow from the strangulation elements. And so this can look many different ways, but one of the takeaways that I'd love for this audience is to understand that emotions live in the brain, and that in addition to being forgetful, having difficulty multitasking, having difficulty organizing a sequence of things, there's also the emotional changes that occur in the brain, like being quick to anger, having PTSD, having a sense of depression, or even suicidality. And in terms of the workplace, we did a study recently in several thousand first responders in a southern state. And we asked them if any of them had been diagnosed with PTSD. And then we took a survey of how many lifetime concussions they had. And would you believe that the number of lifetime concussions they had, that includes sports and violence and fights and being in assaults in the workplace, whatever their experience was, the number of lifetime concussions was more predictive of who would develop PTSD than was the actual emotional element of those events. So I think we're really onto something here with this conversation about what part is the brain injury and what part is lived experience. And personally, I can't wait for Dr. de Blasio, because she can put us both together and say, when a patient comes to her with both of those, now what do we do?
Right.
Well,
right. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sussman, for that segue.
One
Yes.
more
that sounds
throw
like
in
a,
there. One
Go
more
ahead.
thing in there. I think that verbal violence also can flip your epigenetics to a very negative state. And so verbal violence, I don't want to underplay or underscore how critical that is. Verbal violence could be just as damaging as those concussions, and maybe a different form of concussion altogether. So I think we have to really pull that in as well, because the verbal damage may be just as harmful or almost as harmful as the physical damage. And that's
And it's absolutely and I just want to say that I feel like our research on the traumatic brain injury piece that I bring in as a trauma trained neurosurgeon, from car accidents and sports injuries and all of that to the domestic violent world, it's really, this is present as well as a lived experience.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sussman. Okay, so we've heard about these things. We've heard from Dr. Pierce, and we've heard from Dr. Sussman. There is light at the end of the tunnel here. And I think Dr. de Blasio is having some fantastic success with her therapeutic sexual violence recovery program. And we're anxiously awaiting for you to share with our group on what you're doing, Dr. de Blasio. So please share with us.
So I just want to go back to Dr. Sussman's lead-in that around these issues, and I'll just touch on that and then go into the therapeutic program. I think one of the questions that often is neglected in a therapy room is, have you had a TBI? Have you had experiences? And some therapists do ask, and I would say that does happen. I don't know if it's routine to think about how does that play in. A thorough assessment would include that. But it is important to, we all see things from our perspective and from our training. And I'm trained a lot in how to do therapy. I'm not necessarily trained in the neuroscience of TBIs, unless I do that on my own. So I just think it's an important thing, to sort of flag out there to keep in mind. I think the other thing about it, as I hear you talk about it, Dr. Sussman, is that it takes away the blame that you might feel. So for example, if your abuser has had a TBI and is, abusive. If you know that the TBI is impacting their frontal lobe and their impulse control, hopefully you will get the knowledge that it isn't that you set him off or her off, but that there's a physical neurological problem. Now that's a big leap from it's my fault and I shouldn't have done that to there's something going on here. But it's an important distinction that I think with education and getting that word out can help, because it's so difficult for domestic violence survivors to leave. And there's so much self-blame. All survivors of all types of assault often carry a lot of self-blame. So having that knowledge and having that knowledge be more widespread, I think can be really helping with the reducing that self-blame that a survivor might feel, that it's my fault. No, there's something else going on here. In terms of the therapeutic empowerment self-defense program, we took what we knew from the empowerment self-defense program that we've been running for 20 years, which is trauma-informed, strength-based, really powerful, and watching people come into their body and reclaiming their voice. It's been so gratifying to offer that. And we also knew that there were survivors who just wouldn't feel comfortable in a group setting doing that kind of work. And it can be very activating. And so it's really important that that whoever is instructing that understands that someone might be activated in either a dissociative state, meaning they shut down, or in an activated state, meaning that they are adrenalized. And knowing how to respond to that, I think, is really critical. But it's difficult in a group setting to really notice if there's 20 people there, to really notice what is really happening there. So we took that framework, that curriculum, and we fine-tuned it to much more of a therapeutic program. So we offer it with individual sessions. We do a lot of psychoeducation about the neurobiology of trauma. And what I find in those individual sessions is a couple of things. One is it really takes the mystery out of triggering or activation, because we do a lot of brain science education. Here's what happens when the assault happened, when trauma happened, and here's why you might be activated. And we spend a lot of time talking about that, as well as things like affirmative consent, which we do in our general classes as well. But a lot of psychoeducation. And then we do some small group sessions with all survivors. They all know that they're survivors. No one has to share anything, but the key component is reparative movement. So, I think about, and not that I think about it, people much smarter than I think about trauma being locked in the body. And if trauma is locked in the body, then the key is also in the body. So using the body to help facilitate healing is part of what we do in those group sessions. And there's a whole brain science behind that. But we pair that psychoeducation with really mindful movement in a reparative, safe environment, and that helps facilitate healing, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. Dr. de Blasio, could you tell me, you shared in a couple of our conversations some difference in results that you're having. I think you said it was like 6 times faster. Could you share something on that?
Well, I've been doing trauma therapy for my entire career, and it's very gratifying work, but it can take a long time. And we also come not most, because things have changed, I think, in recent years, but at least the way I was trained, it was talk therapy. And so it's coming from a different part of the brain than what we're using when we're doing this reparative work, which involves the body. So these sessions that we do in the therapeutic program, we have no more than 3 individual sessions typically, and 3 group sessions. So in 6 sessions, we've seen pretty transformational results where people walk out of that first group session, and sometimes even just the individual session, they walk out physically showing a difference in their body and how they carry themselves. And for some people, it's the first time they've really tuned into their body in a way that feels safe and it feels healing. Because we're really able to give them, if they are activated, we're really able to help them move through it in a way where they have control, they have safety, and they have that reparative motion, which is really important to the healing.
Great. And I think you've secured a grant to research this, to actually put some meat on the bones for this. Is this true?
Yes, we are. We've been offering this for, I think, 4 or 5 years through the Vermont Center for Crime Victim Services has given us we have a federal grant for that. And we have one of our team members is using the data, qualitative and quantitative data for her dissertation, and is ready to write that up. But we've collected data all along. We're just data people. So even in our community classes where we do the empowerment self-defense, we always collect data, because it's important to know that what you're doing matters, what you're doing works. Sometimes we feel good about what we're doing, but it isn't actually the most effective way to approach something. So we're very data driven.
Great.
And we want to hear the voices of the people who are taking either the therapeutic program or the classes. We want to hear them because they have wisdom too. And we want that. We want to count on that wisdom.
Thank you, Dr. de Blasio. Fantastic work. Dr. Pierce, I'm going to come back to you. So one of the things in our conversations that continues to stand out, and I continue to share your thoughts with people that in my circle, and that is that we really need to start taking a different approach. When someone presents as having cancer, there is a whole approach that goes into healing that. When we hear that someone is impacted by lead poisoning, we have a whole approach around mitigating that. So could you share with us how you think this should be violence prevention, or one who has been impacted by violence and is carrying trauma? How should we approach this? What are your thoughts? Please share.
I love that. And I love Dr. de Blasio's healing with the side of prevention and prevention with the side of healing. I love that, And so the whole entire thing, like if a child like say a child is diagnosed with cancer, we figure out exactly what went wrong, what's going wrong. And then we compare it to all of the understandings that we have, collective understandings to date. And then we figure out a very specific treatment plan for that problem. And then we attack it and we tackle it, and we tackle it with the family and with the child. And then we follow to see if it is working or not. We have ways of checking to see, is it working? If it's not working, we change our plan. It's such personalized, literally so personalized for every single child. And same thing with lead. If we have a problem, we figure it out, we treat it, and then we keep figuring it out until the lead is mitigated. At least that's what we're supposed to do. And yet when a child is diagnosed with physical abuse, let's just use physical abuse, for example, we treat it as if the only problem is that fracture, or that the only problem is that bruise, or that the only problem is that brain injury if the child is still surviving, as if somehow miraculously, once the injury is invisible, so is the trauma. And but the trauma is not invisible at all. It's getting embedded into these children. And so to dismiss it, or to think that the solution might be to just send somebody to a parenting class and tell them not to hit the child, or telling somebody not to shake a baby, or telling somebody to do that, it's huge assumptions that have been made that aren't even the real driving problem of how it happened in the first place, but why that. I love that you called it, what was it, Dr. Zussman, where you called it, I'm taking notes here, the dreadful lived experience. Love that. The dreadful lived experiences. And just like people talk about adverse childhood experiences, I call them adverse childhood environments. So if we don't start tackling the environment and thinking about the environment as being the toxidrome that's actually affecting these children and their long outcomes, then our treatment plans are going to fall way short. So yeah, it is wildly different. No longer to just dump this onto social services and then blame them when something goes wrong. It's so easy to do that, but it's a ridiculous scapegoat, because we actually throw it onto the shoulders of people that don't have the skills that are needed to actually follow that child all the way to healing, all the way to health, all the way to like looking at their epigenetics. Are we back in the proper state? If not, what can we do? And let's treat this like something that really matters, and treat these victims as violence as just as important as a cancer victim or as anything else. And cancer used to be taboo. People wouldn't even say that word. When I was younger, people were afraid to say it as if it was contagious. And I think that sometimes people are afraid to talk about violence, but once we embrace it from the health community, from the social community, from the athletic community, we embrace it, make it our own, the intention of repairing and restoring health, then we can really get somewhere. Was that your question?
Yeah, that was great, Dr. Pierce. Thank you. And you would be well, you wouldn't be surprised, but so many people that we talk to, and so many even current clients, they are adverse to acknowledging violence. It's just they know it's happening. They admit that it's happening. We understand violence from microaggression to full-blown physical event is impacting their workplace every day. But we have to call it something else. We can't call it violence. So thank you for reminding us that, unfortunately, as a society, that's how we treat this. So
Yeah.
we're always going to fall a little short.
I think that we should embrace it, just like, for the longest, the medical community, believe it or not, didn't believe in germs. And so, but once they could see them, once they found a way to measure them, once they started seeing that people had a better outcome when they actually treated people like they were being exposed to germs and did something about it, health outcomes changed wildly and dramatically. And so I feel like we are on the precipice of exactly that, with violence and its damage and its toxin that it is for us as a human, as a society. And so once we're finding better ways to measure it, and then finding better ways to actually measure better outcomes through embracing something very different than what is just currently, which is called the ignore method, pretend and ignore method, which isn't working. I think I think it's gonna be a very different world. I mean, I really feel like it could be, at least.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pierce. So Dr. Sussman, I have another question for you. So we have had conversations about, and I think you touched upon it when I asked about what happens to the memory, but when someone is in a car accident and the police start asking them questions, and they immediately, because of a TBI that occurred during the accident, and they say things like, I don't remember if I pushed the gas or the brake, or I don't remember if they came from the right or from the left. They immediately get pushed into concussion protocol, TBI protocol, and it stops. They're not accused of lying. They're not accused of fabricating. They're not accused of anything. They're just tended to, right, Dr. Sussman? But because we're not checking, because it's not part of the protocol for domestic violence survivors, at least not mainstream protocols, this isn't happening. They're not, when they're clouded, or they can't remember something, or it just goes to their credibility. It doesn't go to, could a TBI have occurred? So could you please just share, do we have the chance of getting this into real protocol interviewing process?
Yes, well, we've already started working with the Los Angeles Police Department on this, because unanimously the officers would say things like, well, I hate those calls because the women keep changing their story, or they're trying to cover up. And they would tell a story, and I'd say, well, give me an example, and they'd say, well, first she was upstairs, then she was downstairs, and she can't remember how she got from upstairs to downstairs. And I'm like, well, great, you just diagnosed the brain injury. If somebody has a gap in their story and they've had any exposure to physical trauma, that's one of the ways that we actually make the diagnosis of concussion. It has a medical term, which obviously has more syllables than we need, but it's called anterograde, meaning forward amnesia, where the brain actually turns off for a little bit, even if the lights are on. Somebody might be looking around, they might be able to say a few words or do some things like take pictures of the accident if that's what they're used to doing anyway, but they don't actually acquire the new memories and the detail and the fabric of those new memories. I think that's really important to bring out, and I think it's going to change the way we think about these brain injuries in the world of violence.
Thank you, Dr. Sussman.
Arlene, could I add something to that?
Please do.
I'm thinking about it from a trauma vantage point, which is the lens that I use. And I think about how trauma, what happens when there's an initial trauma, and what happens with the brain, and what you remember and don't remember. And you use the example of a car accident. I had a serious car accident many years ago, and within minutes, the police officer was asking me what happened. I was still shaking. I was in kind of a mode where the right side of my brain could identify the sensory information, but the left side of my brain hadn't processed the narrative yet. When I got home a couple of hours later, he asked me whether I applied the brake. Then I was able to remember, well, of course I applied the brake, because it would be impossible not to. That's what we do automatically. My point is that trauma, we remember things differently in a trauma situation. The kind of the cognitive part of our brain goes offline. We encode the sensory cues. It's not in a logical format. So when we try to recall it, it's done without a timestamp. It's not necessarily logical, because it's the right side of our brain that has encoded that information. A good example, whether you believe it or not, is Christine Blasey Ford, who was interviewed during the Kavanaugh hearing, and her testimony could be a case study in how does the brain encode and remember trauma. Because when they asked her logical questions, she couldn't respond like this happened and then this happened and then this happened, but she could tell you with incredible detail what some of the sensory cues were. Some things were, just seared into her memory. That's how trauma works. So in addition to what you're saying, Dr. Zussman, about the TBI, we have to also have the lens of, well, how does trauma interact with that? And how do we think about that? The same thing with consent and legal proceedings around sexual assault survivors. Well, did you say no? Used to be the standard. And what you don't know about neuroscience, if you're in that field, the law enforcement field, is that Broca's area, the speech area of the brain, goes offline during a traumatic event. And again, it's that right side of the brain, not the left side of the brain. So you may ended up in that freeze response, that tonic immobility. You couldn't fight back. You couldn't say no. And then in past times, that has been used against survivors as somehow they didn't resist hard enough, when it was just a natural neurobiological response to an incredible stress. Yeah. So I just had to sort of add that to what you said.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
May I add something as well?
Yes.
Also, her speaking made me think about children that have been exposed to violence, young children especially, and then they can't learn. They have this tremendous ability or inability to learn. They can't learn as well anymore. They can't retain things. They don't remember things. They can't learn. And then they get labeled as not smart. And then they get labeled as disabled. And then it just escalates and it snowballs. It becomes structural for them. And they begin to believe it as well. And their parents get more and more frustrated with them. So this snowball effect, this negative snowball effect, is this invisible trauma that we're talking about as a whole group, that violence has. It's like this insidious ability to cause this learning disability as well, when in fact it's not a learning disability. It's part of the neural process that's going on. And if we realize that that's what's happening, we could treat it differently, could act differently. Back to your conversation about treating cancer, treating this brain shutting off in a very different way and seeing it very differently, so that we don't just continue to think these children just need some kind of special need class and just almost get dismissed.
I have a really powerful example that I want to share that I think brings that home for all of us. I have a patient who had somewhere between 12 and 15 brain injuries from an ongoing domestic violence situation, and she lost her kids because she would forget to pick them up at school, and her perpetrator gaslit her in front of the judge, saying, well, she's a bad mom, and she lost it. And I said, well, you've got multiple brain injuries. For our car accident patients, we have them, set an alarm on their phone. If the kids leave it, come out at 3 o'clock, we have them set it at 2:30, because with their brain injury, they're not going to remember. And this woman, to Mandy's comment in the chat of how it pivots when we think of this as a physical injury rather than just as the mental health label that it's been given in our society. She was so empowered to be able to say, you mean to tell me that, fill in the blank with a word that has 4 letters. You mean to tell me that guy who pushed me down the flight of stairs is why I didn't remember to pick my kids up at school, and why I was told I was a bad mother and thought I was a bad mother. So I feel like that is just the most vivid example of what the hidden brain injury may mean in the day-to-day life of folks who we're working with and, going to school with, having lunch with.
We can change these stories. And I love that. I love that example. Switch the narrative, change the story. We can totally change the story.
I mean, what each one of you has done has taken what basically the theme is: neurobiology matters. What's happening in the brain matters, whether it's trauma induced where you're highly adrenalized and so you can't focus in school, or you have a TBI due to the violence that you've had to endure. Either way, or both, neurobiology matters. The brain matters.
Yes. So, Dr. de Blasio, I just want you, I'm going to call you back up, and through our conversations, the goal of the summit has always been to share information that's working, that's not working, open up our mind to violence is happening everywhere. It's occurring in every sector. What can we learn from each other? And you shared something in one of our other meetings that's really was an example of de-silo, what our goal is to de-silo these issues, right? And you said, I look at every patient differently now. I look at my patient through a Dr. Pierce lens, and I look at my patient through a Dr. Sussman lens. Please share about that.
Well, it's been interesting. We've been having these meetings, and I have to say, I know we're here as a panel discussion, but I am here as a learner. And I feel like every time I hear Dr. Sussman or Dr. Pierce talk, I'm like, oh, I got to file that away. I need to use that information because it enriches what I do. I think so often in healthcare, at least it's been my experience personally, I can go to one doctor and they'll tell me about my foot, and I'll go to another doctor to tell me about my hand, but the two never talk, and so we do that in our fields as well. It's where it's so, we have our professional tunnel vision, I think at times, and hearing from other people who are coming at a similar issue, but from an entirely different vantage point. To me, it just enriches the view and the perspective and gets me to think about, this is a whole person, and how do I treat this whole person using information from these different fields to better help them? Even if I personally can't do it, I'm thinking about things a little bit differently in terms of factors that may need to be addressed in some other way, or factors that may help them better understand what's going on for them. Understanding a TBI and the impact of that is profound in terms of helping you to understand, this is what I need to adjust to, deal with, and accept. Same thing with trauma, understanding trauma. Now, here's the neurobiology of it. This is why I'm activated. This isn't just that there's something wrong with me, but there's a natural response. And I think of it as a neurobiological reflex to a similar cue that was present when the trauma occurred that causes this trauma activation. And when people know that, it changes how they see what happens and what they do with what happens. So more information, to me, is a gold mine of ways to help people better.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll throw in there is that it's really critical for us to remember that brain cells aren't just in the brain. You have neurocells throughout your whole body. You have, millions of cells that are that were developed at the exact same time as your brain. They're exactly brain cells, but they're throughout the entire GI tract. And so when these children present with these extreme GI issues, is that a sign of concussion? I mean, we have to really think differently and stop just parsing things to one region and thinking too simplistically about it, so.
Well, just taking on that, I think about the gut feeling we often have.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking about, that intuition. In my field, it's called neuroception. When you pick up cues of danger or discomfort, before your brain has really processed them, your body tells you this isn't okay. It's that gut feeling. It's those neurons in various parts of the body. So it's fascinating stuff.
It is fascinating, yeah.
So some of the feedback we got from our first session was that our participants would like more time in the breakout room. So I'm going to, again, you know how I feel. We could chat forever. I love chatting with you. So we're going to go to these breakout rooms. I'm sure that our participants will have questions for you. But if we could also put to conversation, what does a trauma-informed workplace look like? How does working and using a trauma-informed lens improve workplace culture in your personal sectors? If you want to share some information on that, and then ask away to these wonderful panelists, I'm sure you have some great questions for them. So Nikki, if you could move us into the breakout session. Before we go to the question that I posed, I'd like to take questions from you for Dr. Pierce. Anyone have a question for Dr. Pierce? Please raise your hand. I figured you guys would have something. You're okay. All right. Well, then let's just discuss our prompting question, which is, what does a trauma-informed workplace look like for you?
Yeah. For me?
Go for it.
For the group?
Go for it. Dr. Pierce, start us off.
Okay. Yeah. For me, a trauma-informed workplace, for me, it's my mission and my passion has been able to develop tools that literally clinical decision rules and tools and apps that help us recognize the earliest manifestations of trauma. And so just like I want to help physicians and social workers and nurses and EMTs and paramedics and anyone else that'll listen, I want to help teachers be able to recognize those early signs of physical abuse. I also hope to develop tools and apps that help people recognize early signs of violence exposure. And so in order to really do trauma-informed care, I feel like we need to first be able to recognize it at its very first eking, so the very first moments. And then also the cool thing that we could do as well is helping other, I'm a pediatrician, right? So I'm focusing on children and helping parents and children recognize when others are being exposed to violence and when their reactions are like symptomatic of violence exposure, because then you start engaging people in a way that doesn't shun them or push them away or even bully them, but it actually helps others embrace and think of, just like you wouldn't shame somebody with cancer, you wouldn't shame somebody that's having struggling with violence exposure as well. So trauma-informed care first has to start with much better tools, much better knowledge of how to even recognize when violence is actually at play, like an undertow. It's like an undertow. I feel like it's like an undertow for these kids,
Great.
Thank you. That brings up oh, sorry.
Go for it, Krista.
Okay, well, that brings up a question for me because I had a workplace once and I felt like they didn't care about being trauma informed. And so like my question is, how do we get people to care that people are experiencing violence, that people might have these adverse effects to violence? I mean, I think as long as the workplace was just functioning at a base level, they didn't care what was going on in the personal lives of their staff. So how do we bring that care?
Yeah, that's a great question. What do? You mind me asking what the context is, or is that
Well,
okay?
I worked for like a sort of a conservative nonprofit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a nonprofit, but they were run by conservatives and
Right.
in the sort of agriculture realm.
Yeah.
So Krista, Dr. Pierce, if you don't mind, I think this comes back to that comment that Dr. Pierce shared with us in the main session, which is we have to shed some light. We have to stop, like, we can't use the word violence, or we have to call it out. We have to acknowledge it. We have to accept it. It is happening to all of us every day. It is robbing us every day. So I think that's first. And I think the way we show in a corporate setting or in an institutional setting is what PAVE is trying to do, is we're really trying to show, when things improve, when we create a better culture, what did that do for the bottom line? What did that do for retention? What did that do for turnover or presentism of your employees? So I think by being able to show that in real survey and assessment terms, putting real figures on that and percentages on that, I think we start getting people to look at that.
Yeah.
Dr. Pierce.
And two, sometimes when it is very hard to get certain organizations to actually care, they only pretend to care because it looks good to care. It looks horrible to not care. So then they just fake care. And so can it feel good? Never does it. So fake caring and real caring are wildly different. And the National Realtors Association was just like which is the largest real estate association in the country, apparently, with millions of like members, apparently just got called out through the New York Times of having a culture of both violence and permissiveness, of just really bad behavior among leaderships, and of intimidating women. All kinds of things were happening. And so that call out, suddenly the whole entire organization that just pretended to care for years, completely, now people are starting to like lose jobs and people are starting to reorganize and they're getting focus groups together. So I don't know if that will really amount to anything or not, if they're trying to just save face. But the fact is that they were just completely pedaling along with fake caring until they were called out publicly. So sometimes if something's really and truly like that, I feel like we have to become more and more bold to actually have, things like New York Times or whomever, they will investigate things and they will care about this. And the more that we do our jobs in helping through research and through verbal action and through PAVE, the more that we do our jobs of helping, put real, as you call it, meat on the bones. I like that. As we put real meat on the bones, then I think more and more people feel emboldened to have the proper action that's needed to actually really push this forward. But if we, I think if we swim together, it's much better than swimming out on the ocean by yourself, you know.
Mm.
Especially
Thank you,
'cause I
Dr. Pierce. Vivian, you have a question for us.
Yes, I don't know if I should say it's a question or is an experience I want to share. So I happen to have started as a student here just about a year ago, and I had international students with me in the program that I was doing. And so this is not about the workplace, but it's about having people who are, you know, who came from different parts of the world to this place, but have had um, experience in trauma, either because of war in their countries, or domestic violence that they experienced on either themselves or they saw their parents go through it. So it has a way of affecting them even when they come to, in quotes, a sane environment. So I saw the students withdrawn. Even when they came newly, they were doing fantastically well academically, but at a point they sort of, they were still coming to class, but they were not coming there with their they were coming with their body, but not with their soul and spirit. I don't know if you get that. So and this thing has a way of even affecting you as a classmate. So it was huge for me because I happened to be one of the people they called mother hen in the class. I was sort of looking out for everyone, but seeing people in that state affected me in some sort. But I'm over it now. But those people, though the school tried to intervene on their, or they did some interventions for them, but I still up to now have not seen them come back to what they were, or what they were when we first started the program. We're still on the program, we're not done, but they're still lagging.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Vivian. I'm sure Dr. Pierce has something to share with that, but I'll share with you that I think you touched on two things there, right? What we're discussing is people bring that trauma and it impacts their potential. And that's what you saw with your students. And then I also heard that, your mother hen experience and guidance, right? It does create secondary trauma for you and vicarious trauma for you. And it's real.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah. I think that I appreciate you sharing that as well. And I think that that it is so critical. One of the things that as we're all talking and speaking, I think it is so critical to, when we use the word violence or this kind of trauma, it is really critical to move away from this. Everybody just wants to think that it's almost like, especially people in leadership positions, it seems, they want to just pretend that if it's not a direct blow to the head with a fist or a frying pan, that therefore it's not violence or it's not trauma. And then to get people to move away from that and realize that these traumas that are occurring are like the vicarious trauma, for example, that is something that we don't want people to absorb. We want to find ways to help people be resilient and be able to, like the word I use is like when I'm teaching and helping, when I train people to how to diagnose child abuse, and we see some horrific things, and it's so critical that we find in ourselves the ability to be more like Teflon and not charcoal. So what I mean by that is that we have to have the ability to be resilient and hold our own our own strength and not have that trauma get absorbed into us, and as opposed to charcoal, which causes you to absorb it. So I think that the same exact things that trauma-informed care would be for our patients or people that we're working with are just as critical for us to actually be able to rally around ourselves and have our groups that are like that as well. But to not have it acknowledged, I think, is one of the most damaging things that can happen. And I don't know if that's what you were saying, Vivian. It felt like that it wasn't actually being really heard, or that it's almost they wanted it to remain invisible. Am I misunderstanding? Or because I think that invisibility is sometimes as damaging as anything else.
No, so that when you've been through or you're going through trauma, most times you often don't even know. And even when you feel that this might be what I'm going through, there is also that some sort of denial, and wanting to feel, this is not what I'm going through. So, and that was what happened with those people being new in the country and not even knowing where to seek for that help that is needed was another huge challenge. But like I said, the school has they have the mental health and wellness session, which when I spoke to them, they got counselors to talk to. There were about three students. They got counselors to speak with them.
Oh.
They look better. They are doing better. But like I said, because I know them, they were my classmates. They are not back to what they were like when we first started up until now.
Thank you, Vivian. Heather, you have your hand up?
I do. Thanks, Arlene. Wonderful to be part of this conversation. Very stimulating. Quick comment on calling out the bad behavior of organizations. All in favor of that, because clearly the softer inflections that we've been making around that haven't worked. So there's a cause and effect with that. And I think that's related to the Me Too movement and the momentum that's been built from that. I appreciate what Vivian has demonstrated, and whereas I think around a systems approach to making change happen and for the long term is in attracting people from the recruitment stage of an organization's development and shaping, to have that skill set in recognizing someone who may be impacted, or their on-the-job performance may be impacted by some form of trauma. And also through that recruitment process, and as someone is onboarded into an organization, that they're provided with professional development support and incentives and motivations to maintain that. I mean, we all like to have and recognize the validity and the importance of having empathy in the workplace. Not that it's rewarded a lot, but it is nice to have, and we appreciate it, especially as leaders who are trying to make a difference in our sectors. But particularly, I think, if we're to make preemptive change in this continuum of violence, however we call it, we need to start by forming organizations that acknowledge that trauma exists, that has an impact on people's performance, to call it in around our relationships with the communities, and those are other stakeholders as well, and acknowledging organizations who are doing a good job of this as well. So we're looking at sort of the bookends of this, the bad actors who we can call out. Hopefully they'll change, they'll do something to mitigate this undue notice, and then calling in others who are doing a really good job, even if they're not sure exactly what they're doing, but to put some research money into the analysis of what is a high functioning organization in which the recognition of trauma, behavior, performance, and so on and so forth is acknowledged, And so it becomes a differentiator for some organizations at different sectors for attracting people to want to work there, want to stay there. Because, on the whole list of the things that cause people to join an organization, and I've been around for a while, compensation is, sixth or seventh on the list, but it never gets much higher than that. It's important, but, belonging and all the DEI things that we have been working on for years, and it's now finally found some spotlighting. This is super, super important. And if we're really to disrupt the dominoes, where do we need to start? We need to start by attracting and recruiting into organizations individuals like Vivian, who already have a predisposition towards this skill set. I'm going to call it a skill set because we teach it in ESD.
Yeah.
That's it for me.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I love that.
Thanks, Heather. Did you want to respond, Dr. Pierce, to that, or?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I'll just brief because I know Sarah has something as well, but I would really love that. And I did a study once where we traveled all over the state of Kentucky or the Commonwealth of Kentucky and to all the different social services places where children had been removed. And we interviewed people to find out what their favorite case was. What was there? Where did they feel like they'd had the biggest impact, and what Commonwealth areas felt like they'd done a really good job with helping their children versus places where we had a lot of deaths and a lot of bad outcomes. What was interesting is that it kind of goes along with exactly with what Heather was just talking about. There was often a few people there that really had a very key skill set at helping people stay focused and not absorb the vicarious trauma and stay true to what they were trying to do, but in an empathetic way. And so it was actually really interesting. I never thought about it from this perspective, but understanding where we are most successful and who is most successful, and then through maybe a Forbes top places to work, like showcasing that and shining a big, huge light on that and celebrating that can suddenly make other people, the fakers that are pretending they care, then they actually suddenly do care. How do we transition people from fake caring to real caring,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think just to chime in on that, Dr. Pierce, I think we have to, name and shame, but we also have to name and fame. I think it has to be both. So, Sarah, please share with us.
One thing that I think is really helpful is an education to an employment group of that childhood trauma doesn't stay in childhood. So I'm a survivor of childhood trauma from my earliest memories until I left when I was 18 years old. And what that's looked like for me in my adulthood is it has a great impact on my everyday life as an adult. And it included all of things like you've talked about, learning struggles as a child, relationships, all those things. But how that translates, having education to employers about the ACEs, like it affects the body. I can't tell you how many times I've been in medical situations. Now I have medical trauma because of my childhood trauma that caused me to go. I was having, something going on in my body, and I went and, doctors were like, oh, you're essentially making it up, but it wasn't. It was a stress response from trauma. So then you're adding trauma onto trauma, right? So and to this day, 20 years later, I'm in my 40s and I still have sometimes, activations going to the doctor, especially if I feel unheard in those places, but it affects the body. So it affects the nervous system. It's an ongoing effect of the nervous system. It's an ongoing effect of the neurobiology. And I've been, I have a great therapist that I've been working with for 20 years. So it affects, the neurobiology of something. It affects, I'm a high performer, I think, in my jobs. But what I found in working in a lot of places is that most places don't have an understanding of one, trauma, but two, how those affect the body, how they affect your ability to focus for long periods of time. I've been diagnosed with ADHD, but a lot of times my brain thinks it's more like my trauma makes it hard for me to focus sometimes. So you think about all of these things that I have to climb a hill to do my job well every day. And I found myself in so many places where just the lack of understanding of that could feel like violence to me. So in becoming a leader in the workplace that I am in now, I do my best, not perfect as a leader for sure, but I do my best to create a space for people to have their different experiences, to have flexibility if their body is activating and they need to take an afternoon off, to give them more levels of control and understanding of how their own experiences might be impacting their workplace, and if they need to take a break and be able to come back to the focus. So I think that there's an education piece that's really important in the workplace of, it's not just like, oh, it comes up in this way. Like for somebody who's had a lot of childhood trauma, it really comes out in so many different ways at different times under different circumstances. And having some of those understanding and flexibility, I think, can lead to compassion and empathy in the workplace. While it's also important to still have, we still have to meet metrics, we still have to do a good job, we still have to show up, but there can be understanding in those spaces, because what I think sometimes happens is that companies will minimize the position or the opportunity of the person who has trauma because they don't want to deal with all of that, or they don't want to be flexible with it, and they really lose out on the brilliance of that person, their intuition, their mind, the way they're operate differently in the world because of their experience. So Dr. Clay-Pierce, I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about that bridge between that childhood trauma and the need for education of how it affects the adult life.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so clear, like as you were speaking, what is so clear is that traumas from childhood trauma can be pulled forward and cause disability, but in truth, clearly for you and for me and for many, many people, it becomes an ability that even is maybe beyond what somebody that hasn't experienced it before. And so I think that there's a huge opportunity to understand that there's something that's unique and a gift in a way that can be brought into organizations when people have life experiences like that are so much richer and deeper than if somebody that hasn't experienced that. So taking it and turning it into literally an ability that is actually quite a special ability is pretty cool, I think. And I think that having more and more organizations understand, there's a really cool book, and I can't remember the name of it, so that isn't helpful, I'm sure, but a really cool book that talks about people that have dyslexia and how some of the best inventors in the world and some of the most interesting and genius ideas have come up from people that have really pretty severe dyslexia. And it's pretty cool because they were required to think differently. They had to navigate the world differently. And because they navigated the world differently, they didn't just fall into the old standard boring rut. They didn't just fall into the fake caring. They actually really cared, and they really brought their whole selves and their real selves and their creativity to solutions and to problems. And so I think that the same thing is true for trauma survivors. And then I kind of came up with a term when you were speaking. It's like you were talking about your neurosystem is activated. And I think that sometimes we go through life with neurosystem concussions, just like we think of traumatic brain injury. I think our whole entire neurosystem is concussed in a way, but understanding that helps us reframe it and approach it and tackle it in a very different way, because you're obviously a very determined person. And I think that that's one of the byproducts often is like this intense creativity and determination that can come out of like those life experiences. And how do we foster resilience in more and more people that are experiencing that kind of trauma?
Thank you, Dr. Pierce. I love that. We are out of this session in 2 minutes, so I do want to open the floor to Dr. Louise.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, there's so much to talk about here. And I really love what you were just talking about, Dr. Pierce, as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I've had a long journey, but the fact is, I do think that it has resulted in me being a special person, a person who can really care about other people, and having to overcome those things really is kind of a gift. And there's so many things to pull in here. For example, I think Tai Chi has been a healing force in my life. That physical movement, the mental focus, the breathing, the becoming aware of the body, being present in the world is such a gift. And so it's really interesting to me to think about all the different ways that we can heal this trauma. And I'm also thinking about my students. I teach children and adults with learning differences, and the ones with traumatic brain injuries are the most mysterious ones to me. They're the hardest to treat. And now I'm thinking maybe there's something more that I can learn, that I can bring to those people, and that this empowering self-defense perhaps might be a bridge to helping those people in my teaching setting. So anyway, I just have lots and lots of stuff I want to talk about, but I know that there's not much time, so I'm going to stop now.
Oh,
And say
so
thank
we're
you.
going to be, thanks. We're going to be ushered out of this this segment. And I just want to point out, I just see a quick similarity in first session. And that is, once again, that yes, we have this, maybe they care, maybe they don't care, maybe they have policies, maybe they have protocols. But it all comes down to, again, if we empower the individual, if we empower them with the ability to set a boundary, with the ability to use their voice, then that's what's truly going to usher in culture change. We can ask leadership to come around, but we have to come from the bottom up and then approach it from the top down. I still see that this empowering the individual with a skill set of human safety skills is where we get our biggest bang for our buck. It's just my 2 cents on my soapbox there.
I love
it. Thank you, Dr. Pierce. So I'm sure you guys feel like I do every time I speak with Dr. Pierce. I need another hour, but we'll make sure we keep these three, on speed dial, and try to bring them back often for you all to chit chat.
Welcome to our breakout room. I'm very excited to have both of you, Christine and Edie, to kind of shape the conversation. What Arlene was talking about was actually us trying to dive into what a trauma-informed approach help reduce workplace violence issues in your sector. So I can give it to Edie to start with, so that we can get the ball rolling, and then we can ask participants to weigh in.
Sure, and I'm super excited to hear the questions, so I'll be super brief, but just saying that one of the ways that brain injury may be present in the workplace is folks who have occipital-cervical headaches, photosensitivity, wearing dark glasses inside. And, these are medical issues, so obviously outside the realm of what a workplace provider would have, but just being open to the idea that there may be more than meets the eye there. Somebody who's always very scattered or disorganized. And then on the perpetrator side, as far as I'm concerned, anybody who goes from 0 to 100 without that logical step of, is my response proportional? Do they have the frontal lobe, oversight to their behavior? If they just react viscerally from a 0 to 100, I think those are the folks that you just want to pause and help make sure that they're being fully evaluated. And in the same way, if you send that person, if it is from a brain injury, maybe they played, college and high school football, and maybe they served in the military, which means they probably had about 6 or 7 concussions over their lifetime. I'm proud of these folks. They're also our heroes and our bravest. But if you're seeing behavior that might be like I'm describing, that I think we want to look at it on both sides in the workplace.
I agree. I feel like giving consideration to that unknown factor, much like we do when we encounter people that actually do suffer from an illness, right? And that the outcome of that behavior has contributed to that illness, we can make that connection. But in the workplace, we just think that it is ego-driven, right? It is power-driven, it is ego-driven, and we're not taking into consideration that maybe our boss, who was, in the Peace Corps, who was in the military, who played pro football or, whatever, probably suffered concussions. And as a result, is very, very short-fused, can be verbally abusive because they don't know how to regulate themselves. And, I think for me as a person who works in a company, not this company, but in companies throughout my life, I look back and I think how that boss treated me makes sense now, because I wasn't putting together that they played rugby So they probably had multiple TBIs, which probably made them behave the way that they did. And it wasn't because it was something that I was doing, right? Christine, what are your thoughts?
So I come at it from a little bit different of an angle. And when I think about a trauma-informed workplace, I think about one of the most essential elements is a sense of safety. So I think about whatever it is that enhances safety is critical, because we need safety in order to learn, we need safety in order to connect, and ultimately we need safety in order to heal. So safety is paramount. How you do that in an organization, I think, is part of the culture. So there needs to be a sense of that there can be open communication, that there's someone to go to if there's an issue, that there's not retaliation, that the power dynamics are such that it enhances that sense of safety. Those are the things that I think are really important in an environment that is trauma informed. Also, that it's predictable, that there's some sense of what happens so that people can kind of adjust to that. Sort of the same things you might do if you were running an ESD class. Those are all the sorts of, you want safety, you want predictability. You also want some sense of control, that you have some ability to have input. Of course, there are limits to that depending on the size of the organization, but those are the elements that I think are really important. And they foster retention, they foster open communication, they foster a healthier work environment. When people feel like they can share what they need to with whoever is appropriate, and it's heard, responded to, and dealt with, that creates a safer environment, I think, for people and is trauma informed.
Well, and
Agreed. I feel like having people as stakeholders
Right.
in the conversation, and also using what you were calling predictables or whatever you were saying.
Predictability.
Yeah, predictability, like through procedures and protocols, when people understand that they know that they have a system to follow, there's a sense of safety in that. Edie?
I just wanted to say that regardless of the etiology, whether it's a brain injury or a bad day or anything else, there is absolutely zero tolerance for violence or abuse in the workplace. So it doesn't matter to me what the cause is. The reason that I'm calling out the cause is just to try to help bring that element into how we mitigate. And so, like, for example, if I have a former CFO, wears his Argyle sweater, drives the kids to church on Sunday. If I have that fellow and he's had a car accident and he tells me that he feels like he escalates so quickly that he could be violent in his home after the car accident, we don't say to him, well, let's talk about those feelings. What we say to him is, look, after a car accident, if you recognize that you're escalating, learn, and we teach the family to learn, what are some of the first signs? So is the first sign that they're breathing heavy? Is the first sign that they're tremulous? Is the first sign that their voice increases in its inflection? What's the first sign? Cue to that. Say, oh, I must be getting accelerated. And if you're not able to say, is that proportional? Then we teach and cue our car accident people to go ahead and remove themselves from an environment. We ask them, where's your safe place? Where's your good place, your quiet place? Sometimes it's a den chair, sometimes it's their bedroom. We have them make a plan for what to do when they feel like they're escalating since this car accident. And we educate the family and we say, and if your loved one continues to escalate, let them know that you love them. Let them know that you appreciate that they're getting upset and that the brain injury may have something to do with it. And they leave the house or they get themselves safe. But this has been just an incredible lens where we've brought the psychology piece into the immediate event, into the de-escalation process bringing the brain injury conversation and using it as a source of empowerment. So most importantly, regardless of the cause, it doesn't matter if you're in the workplace, you're not going to know the cause. We're not responsible for the cause. We're not empowered to treat or diagnose the cause. We need to be safe. We need to have clear workplace boundaries. But when we go to rehabilitate that environment, we really have to have an appreciation that there's a subset of people there who, based on their lived experience, whether it's epigenetics, as we've heard, whether it's a lived experience, or whether it's direct brain injury, we need to understand that when there is violence in the workplace, likely there's a change in any or all of those in both the victim and the perpetrator.
So when I hear that, I think very simply, I think compassion with boundaries. You know, it's sort of understanding what's going on here, what's behind it, but also there's boundaries so that it keeps everyone safe. And that's important both for the person who might have the TBI, but also the people in that person's life, the people they're working with, and so forth. And I think that's true for so many things, compassion with boundaries. Yeah.
I like that saying. Does anybody have anything they want to contribute? Cassandra?
Yeah, I just there's just a couple things. That one, right, what you just explained is empowerment, right? What you just said, the compassion with boundaries is empowerment. It empowers both of those folks to take control. So I'm like thrilled to be here to meet Dr. de Blasio, because I just came from working with men who use harm, working in groups, and now I'm working at ESD Global. But you know, listening to that, how really those men that use that violence, they'll explain their situation in which they don't have any control. They feel they have no control, right? And when you point that out to them, they're just like, wait, what? And then to be able to say you can have control, right? You can have control of yourself, right? And by compassion and this and boundaries, and it's that simple. And it's just, to me, that's, like I said, I think of it in an empowering situation. Take a minute, you know, just that, and work within that, and being aware that everybody's not you. What's going on probably has nothing to do with you, and they're just getting, and to take that minute. And the only other thing I wanted to talk about was that idea that we were talking, that why we don't want to talk about violence, but because we don't want to talk about violence because then we have to look at our own and how we do that. And I think that's why we can't use those words, because then maybe just maybe it would be us, because it is, because we all use some sort of violence now and again. Anyway.
You mentioned that. I think that's a good point. There's a term called unacknowledged rape, and it comes from the literature, I don't know how far back. And really what it's about is how hard it is to see ourselves as victims. And so it's better to see ourselves as there's something wrong with me than to see myself as somebody did this to me. And I think that's a challenge that, you know, as I work with people, we sort of work through that. So, and part of that is understanding the neurobiology, understanding what happened, understanding that it's not your fault. One of the things we reinforce, and we say it in every possible way that I can think of, is say, no matter what you did, it's, you know, it's not your fault. You know, nothing you did caused the assault. Nothing you did caused the assault. The perpetrator causes the assault. And that can be said in so many different ways and still not always heard until people really understand some of the neurobiology behind it. That tends to make a difference.
Don, you have a question?
Yeah, the conversation so far has been going in a great kind of segue to this. We did have one question from Huva. As education leaders, how do we support teachers in the classroom who have students with a history of exposure to various types of violence? I know my parents are both educators, and I was just kind of curious to see what your thoughts were on this.
Great question.
I'm happy to go in order. I'm happy to take through the bio piece, and then we can move to the psychosocial piece, because it truly is in the educational system, all three. And so for me, our research now shows that 100% of people who've had any physical violence should be evaluated for concussion and brain injuries. So what we would say is, let's get full neuropsych and cognitive testing. Let's get them thoroughly evaluated to see whether there could actually be some structural and functional changes in the brain. In a, you know, that is kind of like the before. That then becomes your new building block. That's the new child you're teaching. And then some of that will heal with appropriate, firstly, safety, make sure there's not a second one while we're healing from the first. So safety becomes paramount. And then it takes 1 to 2 years for folks to heal. Thank goodness kids often heal completely from the brain injury. So you may actually see improvement over time from the structural and functional injuries. And now I am going to hand off to my dear colleague.
So that, I mean, it's a great question. What can teachers do in the classroom when kids have come in with a history or are currently even experiencing trauma that you may or may not know about? And I wish I had like I like little sentences that kind of, summarize things. I don't have a sentence for this. I think it's more like a paragraph or maybe even a textbook, because it's complicated. I think the more you can understand a child's history and you know what some of the triggers might be, that can be helpful. That same sense of predictability and safety is absolutely crucial. Having some support for that child, having some support for teachers. I think that I don't know if trauma is at an all-time high. I hope it is, because I hope it's going to eventually go down. But I think that we're all coming off from 4 years of sort of collective trauma, and teachers are struggling as well. So, there's what do you do with the child who might be coming in with trauma, but what do you do so that you're okay? And that's really important, because co-regulation, that is regulating your state in a calm way so that that translates to the child, is important too. And you can't do that if while this child is struggling, you're oh my godding and you're sort of getting agitated. So it's a complex question. It's both recognizing, understanding, having knowledge about what trauma is, what it looks like, how it relates to child behavior. And it's also, how do you do self-care for the teachers so that they can be in a place where they can really respond to what they're being presented with. I remember I went to a conference many, many years ago, which helped me help teachers understand that kids aren't coming in intentionally trying to push your buttons. The line that I remember was, behaviors or feelings disguised. And so when a child is acting out, there's feelings there's something going on, and remembering that, I think, is really important so that it doesn't get personalized. So a complex question. I can't possibly answer it thoroughly, but that's my quick answer.
I just have one a couple of little pearls to add for Dawn. So the number one symptom statistically for school-age children who've experienced physical violence is attention problems in school. The other thing that we'll note is that those kids may be, just to have compassion, we talked about creating an environment of compassion. They may have headaches. They may be a little bit dizzy. It may be very hard for their eyes to focus. They may have to use a card to stay on the right line when they're reading. The bright lights may bother them. So you may see a child who has a lot of symptoms of traumatic brain injury in the classroom. And, I think that will be one of the items on our future agendas. How do we make classrooms more aware of what this might look like, and our teachers?
Yeah, so just following up on that, it's learning more, it's knowing more, and assuming that there's a reason for it. I think, I remember working with a teacher many years ago who was really frustrated with a child who had ADHD. And she said, I don't understand. Sometimes he can pay attention. And I had to educate her. I was like, well, that is ADHD. Sometimes you pay attention and sometimes you can't. It's a focusing issue. So if you're really interested in it, the child's going to focus. If they're not, then and the same thing with trauma can do the same thing, that they might be able to focus, and then they're impacted by whatever's going on in their body and in their mind. So you don't want to hold that against a child because they can do it okay sometimes, but not others. You need to learn more of what's going on, what's behind this. So.
Wow. Yeah, that's really fascinating.
Sorry.
No, that's fine, Jen. That's really fascinating. I think that really goes into how we've seen this all this research develop. And it definitely goes to show that learning more about the subject is probably the most important step with that. Thank you both for sharing.
Wonderful. Does anybody else have any questions? Even on this subject of schools and teachers and children? Cassandra?
Actually, this isn't about that. It was just, I was just thought about this, about the headaches. Is there have we drawn a line between TBIs from domestic violence and migraines?
Yeah, so it looks as though there's a little bit of a difference in the headache pattern, and this is absolutely not hard and fast. And we have to remember that people who've had domestic violence may have had TBIs from sports, and people who've had TBIs from sports may have had domestic violence. So I want to say this is absolutely a continuum type of thing, but more likely than not, if it's an occipital-cervical headache, if it comes from the back of the neck and comes forward, sometimes people will describe it with a single finger. They say that there's a lancinating burning pain that comes forward. Sometimes they'll describe it as a tightness right up here. That is pretty much a whiplash type of mechanism and tends to be these occipito-cervical migraine headaches, or chronic daily migraines, as they've been called by the experts at Stanford. Put in your differential that is more consistent with a physiologic onset of the headache rather than the traditional vascular migraines. And the headaches that come from traumatic brain injury usually don't have what we call an aura. They don't have the little lights or little tingling or some of the physiologic symptoms. That tends to be more of a classic migraine.
Interesting. One of the other questions that we were going to kind of touch on in the beginning of this session was, is there any scientific or research or technology that supports the work that you're doing, but in around workplace violence?
Well, I mean, I can give a couple of examples. One is we've been asked to look at suicidality in law enforcement. And one of the cases that came forward was the case of Mr. Smith, who passed away after January 6th. We were asked to review that case. And to see the multiple traumatic brain injuries, we've reviewed the video of how many times his head was hit. We've interviewed his wife to see what was he like before and after, what types of, did he have any mental illness exposures before? I mean, she is absolutely lovely. And it is absolutely clear to us that the suicidality, the suicide, the death would not have happened but for the traumatic brain injuries, even in the setting of a challenging day, a dreadful day when the morals and ethics and the conflict there, but the physiology of the brain injury is what she described to us in the symptoms of what happened in those 12 intervening days.
Interesting. Don, did you have a question?
There was a little bit of a follow-up on back to the education points. I know a lot of this looks a lot different from the educator standpoint than it does from the medical professional standpoint. In some districts where, well, I'll just read it verbatim. What does this, I appreciate the suggestion that students have neurological evaluations, but what does that look like in districts where even ARD or IEP district psychology evaluations take months or even longer to access? And I know a lot of that goes to deal with the individual sector where they're at, which school district, that can vary across the nation. I'm just wondering what you have to add to that.
I think for me, my expertise pauses at being able to say that it's important that educators recognize that if a child's experienced physical violence, that they be evaluated and at least request that the process be started. I think that would be the link that I can make from a data-driven approach. The psychosocial elements, I think, are outside of my expertise.
But I can say, having done psychological evaluations, psychoeducational evaluations for 20 years, there is, not only is there a shortage of providers who can offer that work, but there's a shortage of mental health services just in general. So it's a good practical question that I don't have a solution to, that I do think it would be great if we had concerns and kids could be evaluated as to what is happening and what do they need. The reality is, at least here in Vermont, it's slow going, and that's a hard thing to get. So it's a realistic problem. It goes back to how these sorts of issues aren't recognized, valued, and the money doesn't go to them. And it's just sort of a vicious cycle with that, I think.
Mandy?
My question is for Dr. Edie, going back to her example with the January 6th. I was just curious, like, when you were evaluating, I would assume he went to the hospital and they treated him. Would there be anything to prevent, or was it just a combination of the like triggering event and then his brain injury? Were there any signs?
What would have happened differently if the traumatic brain injury had been called out? Well, the first was the individual would have had insight. He had to go back to work, and he shouldn't have been cleared to go back to work. He had an appropriate triage at the first medical facility, which is that he didn't need to be hospitalized and he didn't need any sort of brain surgery. But there's a very long stretch between needing inpatient care because you're comatose or have a brain bleed and having had a moderate to severe brain injury that needs to heal. And so I think because the resources were so overwhelmed and there wasn't any insight on this invisible, I want to call out the fact that brain injury is often invisible. And even in kids where, God forbid, they have a broken arm, we see that it's broken on the, the x-ray, and everybody puts it in a cast. So everybody knows the arm's a problem. But like Dr. Pierce said, the brain piece might be invisible and it needs to be evaluated in the same level of care. But I want to echo what Dawn said, that I do believe, Dawn, that you're exactly right, that this is a system problem. And that as we begin to understand, and then there was another really brilliant comment about like prevention, like why don't we go up front? And I want to give an example. I have a patient who was a pole dancer, and her partner pushed her out of a moving car on the way he was driving her to work. And when she came in with her mom, we explained to her that she had a brain injury. And if this injury had occurred in a football game or a soccer game, that the best practice would be to keep her out of the game and out of practice until she was screened and given permission to return to practice and then return to play. And at the time, we didn't have our data. It was a few years ago. It was one of our first cases. And I said, I want to use the sports process to see if it brings any insight for you all and any insight for us. And they said, okay. And so what we did is we literally put this pole dancer who was pushed out of a moving car with a brain injury through the sports protocol that we always use. That's evidence-based, best practices, the NFL, your kids, all use the same type of thinking. And so every week we brought her back. We said that she should stay with her mom until she was cleared to, go into an environment where she might have another injury. And sure enough, 6 weeks later, this gal actually made a full improvement, and she and her mom came into us and she said, Doc, if you would have given me permission to go back, I would have gone back when I was still injured. Now that my brain is clear and I can see objectively what I've been through, she said, my mom's going to drive me to my pole dancing job. So she was able to go back to work, but this time she was in an environment where she was safe. And I found that to be so empowering for them.
That's great. Hi, Alyssa. Did you have a question?
Hi, sorry, it's pronounced Elisa.
Sorry, Lisa.
I don't apologize. The whole world says it wrong in the West. Don't worry about it. No, it was so funny. It got me to wondering in just this conversation and how it can go in so many different directions. And I understand getting it back to one, but how like in schools, how in some of the what they call more problematic schools, how they'll have like the metal detectors when you walk in. And it's like, well, why isn't there sort of like a detector where the students walk in and they get like a scan of their brain in an educational setting? That way the teacher kind of already knows what they're prepared for that morning. Sometimes I wish we had that in the workplace. So it's like, all right, I'm ready to talk by 10, not at 8. That way it's kind of like a wellness check in a sense. I don't know. It got me thinking in like research development mode of like startups of like, we've got like these handy ed tech pens for dyslexia now. We've got these things that can scan and read this for our eyesight. We've got stuff for the cochlear. Like, where do we have stuff for the neurological side where it's not scary, where we're not implanting anything or nothing of that nature, but taking it from a rational point of view? So that's kind of where my head went. And she said we had 2 minutes. So I just wanted to
Lisa,
give something lighter.
Email in the chat because you and I are aligned. We're working on an app for concussion detection using some of the visual congruence and depth perception. So I would be absolutely thrilled to see if we can find an easier way to screen. I wish we could. or I hope we can in the future.
Looks like everybody is back in. I see some more cameras on. That's great to see your beautiful faces. Great.
That went
Great.
too fast.
Yeah, it did go quickly. Yes, you are right, Jen. Jen, I will let you please report on your group and share with us any. Was it amazing?
It was amazing. And I do want to lead with a question that was prompted by someone from HUVA, which was about educational leaders and how do we support teachers with students who are victim of violence, who act out. And we kind of covered the biological piece and the psychological piece of identifying what those symptoms or those behaviors can look like to understand what's going on with that child and why they're behaving that way. And then also the other side of it in terms of maybe starting to start a protocol for that person when you see them behaving that way, like putting them through this process. I know Edie can probably speak more to it, and Christine can speak more to it because this is their field of expertise. But that was something that came out of it for me. The other sense was, even though there's no tolerance for violence in the workplace, there are ways that we can identify in people that are not behaving correctly in terms of, are they breathing heavy? Are they experiencing any sort of tremor-like behavior? Are they being forgetful and scattered? Not that this is to take away what's happening, but it just puts it into more of a context of understanding. And those that are actually in the workplace find that it is beneficial to have procedures and protocols for them to follow so that they do feel safe in order to help create a more positive workplace culture. That's kind of what, and I'm sure you guys can add to it that we're in my session. There was so much information shared. I was typing like a banshee.
Thank you, Jen. I'll give a quick recap, and then if we have a couple minutes, the docs can chime in on their thoughts of their breakout. In our breakout, one of the first things that came up is, yes, we say that organizations care, but do they really care? And the idea of fake caring. So until they're really called out, things really don't change. And there was the example of the Realtors Association that's just been called out by one of the leading newspapers in the country about really having a ongoing toxic culture. And now it seems that some things are changing there. So, and then around that conversation, it continued to, identify people who have the skills to do better. They're already doing better just kind of innately in their workplace. Identify them, name and fame them. Give more people the skill set so it continues to grow within the workplace culture. Was also discussed that when we're talking about people, well, first I'll touch base that Vivian shared with us the idea that people sometimes even deny that they have trauma. So we have to move through at least the denial process and then help them at that point. And she gave some examples of students that have come to her and were just acknowledging their trauma during her class. And then there was a sharing of as you bring your trauma, your childhood trauma doesn't end, which is exactly, kind of the conversation we're having about we bring our trauma into the workplace as adults. And that it needs to be acknowledged that sometimes we need to create a culture that allows people to take a break, that allows people to take a half day off, that allows people to do these things so that they can heal and then continue to be productive. And then Dr. Pierce shared something I thought was really wonderful, and that the idea that an employee that has moved through their trauma or that is moving through their trauma and becoming more resilient really brings an incredibly unique gift to the workplace. And it needs to be acknowledged that is happening. So I thought that was really powerful. And then last thing I'll say is I heard it in session 1 and I'm hearing it in session 2, that yes, we have these ideas that this is a caring culture at our workplace, that we have protocols and we have policies, but it's still, is it working? It's not caring. So again, I go back to empowering the individual with those human safety skills to try to change culture first and then come from the top down. But that was our session. Docs, we have a couple minutes if you'd like to share any closing comments for us.
I'm just overwhelmed and with the comments from the conversations and all that's said. So I'm sorry I don't have anything to go wow with, but I'm just blown away, you know. So just very excited about the possibility of taking this back. And it's cool that you brought it back full circle. It still goes to personalized medicine, not just for our patients, but for us. It's personalized medicine and to be our best healed self, you know.
Yeah.
Scars and all, you know.
There were so many things you brought up, Arlene, that I would love to just tag onto, but we have like a minute. So I will just reinforce, you know, one of my taglines is like, we're changing the world one empowered person at a time. And that's what we hope to do. And we also need that to change the culture, that it can't be up to the individual to change the culture alone, because it can be very difficult to do that in environments that don't support it. In fact, you might get fired. Or you might face other reparations. So it's a challenging thing. There's a concept or a word, I don't know what it is exactly, but it's called willful blindness. It's when people see that there's a problem, but they won't speak up because it doesn't feel safe to do that. It takes courage to be that empowered person to speak up, not knowing what the result might be. And I just want to applaud the people who do that, because that is how our world changes. And we need to see people not as whistleblowers, but as heroes in changing a culture. And that takes a change in how we think about things and a reception in the environment to those sorts of comments. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. de Blasio. Dr. Sussman? Unmute.
I think for me, what I learned in my takeaway is that if you're in a harassing situation in the workplace or an abusive or overly emotional situation in the workplace, I think the key is that there may be something going on in that individual on multiple levels. And so to me, I feel like listening for what was the teaching point, like what were they trying to say? Well, you need your forms in earlier. Okay. And then, but separating it out and being empowered to say, I hear you say that my forms need to be turned in earlier. And that's the end of it. And the rest of all of that, you know, hand waving and screaming and yelling and whatever the threatening or abusive behavior is, that's not appropriate. And that's the part that needs to be called out, and that we need to empower our employees to own the piece that's relevant, and then recognize that there may be a heck of a lot of stuff that's happened to that person in their own lives, whether it's epigenetic, lived experience, brain injury, a bad day, whatever. We got to get rid of that in the workplace.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Sussman. Okay, so this has been our second session. It's fantastic. Please join us on Tuesday at the same time, same bat time, same bat channel. Our next topic is from sanctuary to battleground, libraries being caught in the culture war, and what we need to do about that. So it's going to be incredible. Also, in the chat, you will see an evaluation form that you could give us some valuable feedback on this session. We'd love to hear from you. Jen, please.
I put in the chat that continued education units are available for this session, 1.5 units for this session. So if you would like to receive an evaluation form, please put your name in the chat and we will email it to you.
Great. Well, thank you again so much. Mary Klein, Christine, Edie, incredible. Yes, clap it up for Mandy. I hear you, I hear it. Incredible. And we will, to those of you who are participating today, I promise you, we will keep this trio of knowledge and passion, as I call them. We will keep them connected and connected to PAVE, and we will continue to share them because for us, they are truly a gift. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, panelists, for being here. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Arlene, and thank you for everyone for attending.
Happy birthday.
Oh,
Happy
thank you.
birthday.
Thank you. No better way to spend it, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And Arlene, I think you really define the value of PAVE, bringing all of these different ideas together and giving us a space to collaborate. So I want to say a personal thank you to you and your team at PAVE.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Edie.
I think it's a recipe for change, just like a recipe for making cookies. You need all different ingredients. That's what I think.
Yep, and persistence.
And persistence, yes.
Thank you. All right. So panelists, if you could stay on just for a second as everybody logs off, and we can connect. Yes, thank you.
Somebody said cookies. That's my cue to go. That's funny.
I know. I was thinking about them now too.
Mandy?
Hang on. Yeah, Mandy.
Hi. Yeah, real quick, because I get nervous, but I wanted to make a comment because I love the panel. My only comment is that people with brain injuries or domestic violence, they're incredibly strong and resilient. And, you know, they have to take care of children, they have to work. And the main thing for me is like when you kind of switch the narrative to, you know, it's a health issue, you give them hope. Like, and that's the biggest thing that I took away from this personally and from you guys speaking professionally. So thank you.
Cool.
Yeah.